Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project with E.C. Sinkowski. My name is Patrick Cummings, and every episode I have the privilege of having a discussion with E.C. on subject matters that range from nutrition to fitness to the choices we can all make to live a healthier, more functional life. By exploring both the principles at play and the actions worth carrying out as a result, it's our goal to get you thinking, get you moving, and get you taking more consistent steps toward optimizing your well-being. Thank you so much for tuning into the episode, to the show this week. I'm just here with a quick introduction to a conversation that EC had recently with Dr. Adrian Chavez. Dr. Chavez is one of the few trusted sources of nutritional information that EC will regularly point people towards. So that should probably tell you all you need to know about Dr. Chavez. He's got a podcast called the Nutrition Science Podcast. You can find him on Instagram, dr.adrian.chavez. The conversation you're about to hear is wide-ranging. EC and Dr. Chavez touch on a number of myths and a number of half-truths that we too often see on social media specifically, but media more broadly. So excited for you to get into it. One quick reminder, if you are not yet following or subscribed to the show wherever you are listening or watching this, please do. It'll help ensure you do not miss another episode. EC and I appreciate it. Without further ado, here is EC and Dr. Adrian Chavez.
I am working on a title for this. I think the working title right now is Getting Out of the Weeds. And I thought you were the perfect person based on the content that I see you put out on social media of kind of helping people navigate, like, what do we really have to focus on and what are some of the more minor details? And I think that's where a lot of people get lost. And I think you would agree. So we've got a bunch of different topics, and I'm hoping that you can help maybe delineate why there might be a concern with some of these, because I think there's sometimes like a little bit of a half truth in there a little bit, and then but maybe where we get a little bit too hyper fixated on. So are you ready?
Yeah, definitely. Let's get it.
Awesome. So one of the popular topics I hear about all the time is concern about cooking temperatures, specifically high cooking temperatures. And then with that, what kind of cooking oil is the best to be using? And so where does that concern come from?
So just like you mentioned a second ago, the concern is always based in some truth. So yes, high cooking temperatures can cause the oxidation of fatty acids in certain types of oils, and this is more common in polyunsaturated fats. So if you're looking at things like canola oil that are a little bit higher in these polyunsaturated fats, they're more susceptible to oxidation than monounsaturated fats and saturated fats. However, this is the important piece, because we always look at, okay, these are more susceptible to oxidation, so they're bad. Are they actually being oxidized to a significant degree in normal cooking processes? And the answer is no, like in any case with any of these oils, unless, and there's one caveat to this, unless you're having like oils that are being reheated over and over again and exposed to really high temperatures, which is going to be the case if you're having fried foods in like a fast food restaurant or something like that. So that's like really when the only time my concern with like oxidation of fatty acids comes in is if you're having fried food at a restaurant, that oil has been exposed to very high levels of heat, multiple cooking cycles over and over again, but we're not doing that at home. Most of us aren't. I mean, if you're frying food at home, your concern should be less with the oils and the fact that you're eating fried food and the amount of oil that you're eating. Like that's really the issue with most people. And this is the concern. I always get this question, what about this oil versus this oil? And the reality is if you're eating enough oil for it to significantly impact your health, you're probably eating too much oil. Like oil is a calorie bomb, essentially. It's extracted fat. It's just like sugar is extracted glucose and extracted carbohydrates. So I don't want to scare people away from eating oil, just like I wouldn't scare people away from eating sugar. There's a time and a place to include these things into your diet. But if you're eating a lot of oil, you're most likely going to cause yourself to eat more calories. And for many, many people, this is a major area of intervention where just paying attention to the amount of oil that you're eating is really going to increase or reduce your calorie intake and not impact your satiety levels that much. When it comes to types of oil, olive oil is the most well-studied oil. There's hundreds of papers demonstrating the benefits of olive oil. It isn't, the most heat stable, but as I mentioned earlier, it isn't going to be oxidized to any significant degree with normal cooking. So I wouldn't even worry about that. And I typically tell people I kind of recommend to just stick with the oils that go with the cooking. Like people ask me like, what type of oil is ideal? Like if I'm cooking Asian food, I'm probably going to use sesame oil to give it a little bit of flavor and to give it that nuttiness and like the flavor profile of your meal and the amount of oil that you use and being mindful of that are kind of probably me more important than minor variations in saturated fatty acid composition.
Yeah, I think I saw that on your social media. I really liked it. It was like the type is way less important than the quantity.
Yeah.
You mentioned oxidation. Can you just give a kind of a brief? Okay, so let's say the fat gets oxidized. Then what are we concerned that's then doing?
So the fats are chemical messengers in our body. It's really interesting. So all of these different fatty acids have different signaling responses that they can contribute to in our body, and when they become oxidized, that interferes with their normal function, and that can lead to them being incorporated into, let's say, for example, LDL cholesterol particles, and that oxidated fatty acid can make the cell membrane less stable, and it can just impact the function of where those fatty acids are being distributed, and that can just have a negative impact on health overall. Now, we don't really have a good quantified like actual outcome that seems to be negative in terms of eating more oxidated fats. Like I haven't seen any great data on like consumption of oxidated fats in negative health outcomes. But from a molecular standpoint, we know that this impacting the function of those fatty acids, which can impact, where those fatty acids get distributed throughout the body.
And one more kind of question on the oil, just because it's so popular. You mentioned polyunsaturated fats are the ones that are kind of the least stable. Can you put that in the context just of seed oils for us?
Yes. Yeah. So the quote unquote seed oils are the those are the ones that tend to be higher in polyunsaturated fats. Now, if someone's describing oil and they're just talking about oxidation, and they're not actually talking about fatty acid composition, they're trying to be manipulative. Like they're not giving you a full faith discussion, because we have to discuss, when we're looking at the impact of an oil, we have to discuss fatty acid composition, but then we also have to discuss the nutrients that come in that oil. And then we also have to discuss the fatty acids in that oil. For example, if you're consuming a lot of dairy fats, or if you're consuming a lot of butter versus if you're consuming a lot of canola oil, well, the canola oil, yes, it's more likely to be oxidized, but the butter is more likely because of the saturated fats in the butter to increase LDL cholesterol. So from an overall picture, from what we've seen and from the human data where people are actually fed butter or canola oil and even heated up canola oil in just in their diet, there seems to be a positive effect of switching some of these saturated fats for polyunsaturated fats. So when people single in on the fact that these are less heat stable, typically they're doing so in a not honest way. They're not giving you an honest description of the totality of the health impact of these different oils. If we look at the total health impact of these different oils, polyunsaturated, the canola and seed oils are probably healthier, quote unquote, when we look at various health outcomes, than consuming butter or a high saturated fat food.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just such a trip, right? Like the actual data shows that we're better off with them. But yet then there's people pushing for more of the saturated fat. But I guess that's just social media for us. But keeping with the cooking theme, because that tends to be a popular one, especially in my community, I get a lot of questions about kind of the cooked versus the raw. Is it more healthy? Maybe not necessarily talking about the oils, but then looking at the food itself. Should I be eating everything raw? And I think it kind of stems from this idea about bioavailability. So maybe you could shed some light on what is bioavailability? What exactly are we talking about there before kind of getting into if we should be focusing on that?
Yeah. So actually, contrary to popular belief, for a lot of nutrients, bioavailability goes up when the foods are cooked, because we have a hard time, for example, with spinach, breaking down those cell walls and accessing the nutrients that are available in the spinach. So the cooking process makes some of those nutrients more bioavailable. And that's the case with a large percentage of nutrients in plant foods. Is when we cook those foods, it breaks down those cell walls a bit, makes them easier to digest, makes it easier for us to extract the nutrients from that food. Now, the other side of this discussion, which is the challenge with nutrition, is there's always two sides that are kind of opposing one another, is when we cook foods, there's also a bit of a nutrient loss. So some nutrients become more bioavailable, some nutrients are lost, and some enzymes are broken down. And so this is like cooked or raw is better is not really a discussion to be had. There's benefits to each. And my recommendation around that is typically to get a percentage of raw and cooked. Some people have a harder time digesting raw vegetables. So in those cases, I always try to encourage, like, okay, it's fine to just have most of your vegetables cooked or all of your vegetables cooked if you're having a hard time digesting them. As long as you're getting them in is the important piece, is just making sure that you're getting that produce in regularly. But that's the challenge with that is that discussion could probably be a semester-long lecture about all of the different changes that can occur in different, and it's different based on the different fruits or based on the different vegetables. Like, for lycopene in tomatoes goes up, but the vitamin C goes down when you cook it. And it's like, does that make it healthier or less healthy? Like, how do we look at the bigger picture of this? And this is where, as you mentioned, getting into the weeds, this is one of those things that when I get asked about these things, it's better not to worry about it. Like, and I know this is hard to, like, sometimes you're like, oh, well, I want to know what's best and you want to do what's best. But in these scenarios where it's a complicated answer, and the best thing to do is going to be what helps you eat produce regularly more often. And if that means eating more cooked, if that means eating more raw, then go with what works best for you. If you're the type of person that can snack on raw cauliflower and broccoli and you're good with that. But if you're the type of person that just prefers things cooked, then just go with your personal preference and what's going to help you meet those produce intake goals.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've seen, it's like it would be impossible. There's no line that delineates everything happens when you cook and everything is better when you eat it raw, based once you start looking at all the nutrients that we care about. So it ends up being this kind of mixed bag anyway. So first step, let's just eat enough, right? Yeah. I love it. Okay, the next one, and this one I actually had to do some research on because I get asked these questions and I'm sometimes like, where does this even come from? Like where was the original source for this? And it's a lot on kind of food combining. And I don't know if there's like a food combining diet. There must be. But I tried to kind of pull some of the rules that I've seen online. I don't know if these are the right ones or not, but I've seen things like, okay, you're not supposed to eat, carbs with fat because I think that might stop your fat burning. I've seen things like don't eat your protein with starches. I think that has something to do with like digestive ability. I've seen things like only eat fruit on an empty stomach. So as far as I understand, it's kind of this idea of like aiding your digestion in a certain way and maybe trying to optimize, what digestive enzymes would be present or what kind of the conditions are needed to digest it. What do you understand about kind of the food combining rules and how much of that should we be paying attention to?
As you mentioned, I've heard every rule in the book. I've heard so many different things in terms of like food combining, food order, how you're supposed to eat your foods. I work in my one-on-one work. I work primarily with digestive issues. So I'm very familiar with how different foods may impact various digestive issues. A lot of this stems from Ayurvedic medicine and principles around Ayurvedic medicine and nutrition of like the fruit on an empty stomach and some of that's where that comes from what I've been able to gather. But how this works is someone will say something, other people will just repeat it, believe it, and it just gets, thought of as fact. The reality is when it comes to, food combining, everyone is different, and operating by specific rules without actually paying attention to your body doesn't make any sense. Like if you are not having a negative digestive response to combining, whatever fats and proteins or whatever, and these are going to be combined, like we should be eating mixed meals. I don't ever recommend trying to like figure out how do you not combine fats and protein? Like you have to eat isolated sources of protein, and it's really difficult. And it ends up just overcomplicating things. And the reality is, like, if you have digestive issues, what works for you is going to be extremely personalized. And this is one of the biggest challenges with people with digestive issues is you're looking for what other people did, you're looking for rules to follow, and you have to pay attention to your body. Like, you have to pay attention to the way that your body's responding to various foods. And if you're paying attention to the way that you're having, like, your symptoms are responding, then you'll know, okay, when I eat fruit and then I eat these foods, that tends to cause a little bit more bloating. Then that might be something that you need to pay attention to for yourself. That shouldn't be a rule that now you say everyone needs to do, because this is what tends to happen is people find what works for them, and then they say, oh, this should work for everyone because it worked for me. And that's just not how our bodies work, especially with digestive issues.
Just to make sure the audience heard that, it sounds like even with your digestive clients, there's no clear patterns or trends that you find yourself recommending necessarily to each client. Like, okay, well, the first thing I do with my digestive clients is take out the fruit or something like that.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, in like, let's say, for example, we have, if it's a client with IBS who's chronically bloated after their meals, and we see that they're eating a very plant-based diet, typically there's going to be a clear path with that client because they're eating what's called the high FODMAPs, or like fermentable carbohydrates. So they're probably eating a lot of those. And for people with IBS, a high FODMAP diet tends to exacerbate symptoms. So for, like, in specific cases, there's like a trend that, and then this is where my expertise comes in, is to be able to identify that and say, okay, this is probably the best approach for you. But it really, I mean, you have to find the low-hanging fruit for you. And I have to look at every aspect of someone's, dietary habits and things first, because sometimes it's really just sleep. Like, that's one of the biggest factors. Like, I have some clients that come to me and that's like, I tell them, hey, we're gonna, I definitely want you to get, like, on a routine with your nutrition, but let's focus on sleep right now. Because if you can start sleeping well, like, you're sleeping 4 hours a night, you're gonna wake up bloated and you're just having digestive issues because your body's in a constant state of sympathetic nervous system activation. And when it comes to digestion, we need that parasympathetic, activation in order to be able to digest food properly. In some cases, doesn't even have to do with food. And this is where it goes back to, like, you can't do the same thing for everyone, because everyone is just, there's so many variables that come into play. And this is the case with other issues, but with digestion, it's stress plays a major role. Lack of sleep plays a major role, and excess exercise can play a major role for some people. And so all of these things really need to be addressed together, as opposed to just looking at what foods could be cut out.
Yeah. No, I love that. Sometimes the nutrition answer is not first working on your diet. One more kind of follow up on the digestion piece, because this one often gets kind of, I think, reiterated frequently, and that is that, like, protein is hard to digest, just as a general concept. Do you know where that came from, or where that keeps being reiterated?
I think it's just because protein requires more, like, enzymatic breakdown, I guess, and, like, acidity. So, like, in our stomach, the stomach will produce a little bit more acid when we eat higher protein foods. And so I think that's probably where it comes from. And then it also slows gastric emptying. So that could be another factor as well.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the programs that I put out for people is my 800-gram challenge, where we focus on adding a healthy amount of fruits and veggies to the diet. So there's always a good amount of adding fiber to the diet is where I often start with people. But with that comes up another topic, and that is that people seem to be fixated on the idea that their fruits and veggies always need to be fresh, locally sourced wild raspberries or something. What about the concerns surrounding eating produce that's frozen or canned? And is it sort of a less than source compared to fresh when people are looking kind of for the most optimal choices?
Yeah, I mean, so I am a big, big, big fan of frozen, because frozen is picked at the peak of ripeness, and then it's frozen.
Yeah.
And then it stays frozen and retains its nutrients while it's frozen, and which it's going to stay frozen through the freezer aisle and into your home until you eat it. With fresh food, or with fresh produce, you have it's being picked before it's ripe, and then you have the nutrient loss that can occur throughout the storage process, throughout the transportation process while it's in the grocery store. And then we just waste a lot of produce when especially we have this idea, okay, I'm going to buy everything fresh. We go buy everyone there's probably a lot of people listening right now that have a bag of like greens in the back of their fridge that like
Hmm.
is really sad and wilted, and this tends to be more common when we have fresh produce. So that's another reason why I'm just a big fan of frozen. Nutrients are pretty much the same. Now there in some cases there could be some loss of certain nutrients, but it's a minor difference. And in the studies that have been done and the important nutrients tested, there's almost no case there's a difference between fresh and frozen. So highly recommend, like most of the produce that I eat is frozen. Definitely do not avoid frozen. And then when it comes to canned, there's a slight nutrient loss in canned versus fresh. So like I think in the studies that I've seen, there's like generally like 10, 15, 20% maybe at the most difference in certain nutrients based on with canned versus fresh. And sometimes the can, they'll add like sugar and then they'll add salt to the can. So then you have the issue of like sodium and added sugar. If you're doing a low sodium can and you're doing, no added sugar for like a fruit, then, it's another convenient solution. I definitely, most of the beans and lentils that I eat are from a can. And then also like corn, your green beans, things like that. Definitely use canned quite often. I try to opt for frozen as frequently as I can, and then I just fill in fresh and like a few things that I like to buy fresh. But I've slowly over the years have gone towards more and more frozen and less fresh, and I've realized now that the majority of my produce intake is definitely from frozen.
Yeah, I mean, when people talk about, switching to eating healthy is always so expensive, it's like, have you tried frozen?
Yeah, that and kind of around some of the other, you kind of alluded to it a second ago, but a lot of people think they have to buy organic local stuff, and
Right.
they have to buy the green labels, and the reality is the difference between organic and conventional produce is marginal. I'm publishing a podcast episode on it this week. I mean, there are nutrient differences. Organic tends to be slightly higher in antioxidant capacity when on average compared to conventional, but there's 10, 15, 20% difference again. And we're looking at sometimes like 2 or 3 times as much for something that's
Mm.
maybe nutritiously 20% better. And people
Mhm.
talk about pesticides. Pesticides are also on organic food. People don't realize this, but organic doesn't mean pesticide free. Organic means they use organic pesticides. And
Right.
another thing I hear all the time, and something that I brought up on my episode this week, is people say, well, we shouldn't use pesticides. So, you know, let's, I'm not eating anything with pesticides. And that's a great idea. But the reality is, like, we would not be able to have a food supply. Like a lot of times we get bombarded with certain messages on social media because they sound great. Like, these influencers will say, these pesticides are trying to kill you, and you got to stay away from them. And the reality is pesticide residues are extremely low on foods. They're tested to be 1,000 times lower than what's expected to cause any negative effect to health. So they test them in animals. They find the amount that causes any negative impact, and they set it 1,000 times lower than that. And so the residues are really low. These get tested all the time. This is what, this is reported. There's open database showing pesticide residues on various foods. And it's a safe amount. Like anyone who's eating, like any study that's ever been done on fresh produce or on produce, or on eating conventional produce, shows positive health effects. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of people that think, oh, well, it's only healthy if it's organic. That's not the case at all. All the studies that have ever been done on produce consumption and health that have shown positive effects are all on conventional produce.
In my earlier days, I worked on a all organic solar powered farm near Montana, near Glacier. And the reason why our crops are so expensive is because we were manually pulling the grubs off of the crops.
Wow.
I mean, it takes a lot of time to run an organic farm. So
Yeah, imagine
preach.
trying to feed. Yeah, imagine trying to feed 300 million people like 5 servings of produce a day off of that. Like it would take. it would take half of the country working to feed the other half, like, and it's just not reasonable. Using pesticides that have been well tested and being able to provide accessible food to a population is a really easy trade-off. But the narratives around, oh, well, it's Monsanto and they're bad and blah blah blah, is just that blows up more on social media than really explaining like the science behind it. Because yes, these companies have done, evil things. All of this is more of a societal thing than anything else. Right. Like we live in a country where capitalism has allowed companies to operate for the bottom line over the sake of people. And that's more so, in my opinion, about our system than it is about these companies. These companies are basically like they have to operate to maximize shareholder profits. And we create these massive organizations that do that. And that's legal in the US to just, or not legal, but it's like celebrated. Like,
right.
Make the most money you can at the expense of everyone else and your success in this society. And it's just like, I think that's more of a societal issue than like people that working at Monsanto are not producing things to try to figure out how to kill off the population. Like they're solving problems. And one of the problems was that there was too many pests on food, and they learned how to create pesticides. And maybe there was some negatives, maybe some things were introduced into the food supply too early, but a lot of this stuff, the regulations end up fixing all of this anyway. When something is found to be harmful, it gets taken off the market. Like that's how the system works.
Yeah. No, I'm glad. I mean, my audience should not be, that should not be the first time they've heard something about organic, but I'm glad that somebody else has addressed it as well. I mean, one of my favorite things to say is, 80 to 90% of people aren't eating enough fruits and veggies from the USDA. So now we're so concerned about the exposure that we're not exposed to. So that's always kind of my organic comeback. But another one with actually fruits and veggies that is common as well is there's this message or narrative again in this space that, our soil quality has declined significantly over the years, and therefore our fruits and veggies are less healthy. Where did that come? Is there truth there? And kind of how do we navigate that now if we have these, crops that have less nutrients?
Yeah, there was a paper that was published, I think it was published in 2004, and it was like trends in nutrient composition of selected foods over the past 50 years. This paper was just misinterpreted like crazy all over social media. I've seen Mark Hyman talk about it multiple times, and that's the area that's where I think a lot of people have just taken what he said and repeat it. But if you actually read the paper, what they say is that yes, there's been a reduction in nutrients. If we look at a cauliflower from 50 years ago versus now, on average, there's a small reduction in a couple of the nutrients. Like it's in most cases they're about the same, but there may be like, magnesium went down 15%, and the highest reduction in any one nutrient, any one food was like 40% or something like that. Mark Hyman, I was sent a video and I responded to it a couple months ago where he said that nutrient loss has been 50%. And it was because of the soil. Like that's just incredibly exaggerated. Like the nutrient composition of our fruits and veggies is significantly smaller than that. And on average, again, like small 10% ish. And in many cases, there wasn't any effect at all. The researchers in this paper even, and this is another thing that blows my mind about the way that it's communicated, is the researchers in this paper said that this reduction in nutrients was not the result of a decline in the nutrition of the soil, but was the result of us deciding to use different types of food. So, for example, we use a different type of cauliflower now that is sweeter, that grows bigger, that looks better. We are selecting for things that consumers want from the food, and what consumers want isn't the amount of vitamin C in it. Like you don't go to the grocery store and you're like, I wonder how much vitamin C is in this. You're like, oh, I'm going to pick the cauliflower that looks the nicest and has the biggest florets and that type of thing. And so it's been a change in the types of actual produce that's available on the market that tend to be slightly less nutritious on average. And that's where the nutrient reduction comes from. Now,
Hmm.
the solution to this is people to actually eat produce. Like, it's a really, really simple solution here because,
Right.
a 20% reduction in your one serving a day of produce, a 20% reduction in the nutrients of one serving a day of produce is not that big of a deal. Let's go
Mhm.
ahead and you're going to get more benefit by adding a serving of produce than worrying about the nutrient losses that may have occurred
Mhm.
in certain foods. So it's exaggerated, and the simple solution is for people to actually eat produce because people aren't. If the entire U.S. just started adding a little bit more vegetables, this isn't like this stuff doesn't matter. This is the stuff that
Yeah.
this is what frustrates me is this stuff is just what it's designed to get people's attention on social media as opposed to like really give you education that's going to help you, like
Mhm.
taking it from a fear mongering perspective, saying that the government is out to get you and the nutrients are losing, the soil's losing nutrients, and you have to buy organic because the non-organic's killing you. All of these things are just playing on the fact that fear draws our attention, and when people take that angle, they blow up on social media.
I think sometimes too, because you kind of mentioned, hey, it could even just be made up in a single serving, is sometimes we get so stuck on these percentages. We hear 10% drop in something and we're like, oh my gosh, it's not worth it. And it's like, okay, well, what's the absolute value? And can we still get to the recommended dietary allowance, by a whole food based diet? And when I've kind of looked at this issue, that's was sort of my conclusions. Like, even with the reduction, so long as I have enough produce and whole foods in the diet, like, what are we worried about? What are we worried about, right?
Yeah, it's just people distracting us from worrying about the right things. And there's people like you, and there's not many of us in this field. Like we make
Mhm.
up the vast minority of people, unfortunately. But the things you need to be worrying about is eating enough produce, eating a balanced diet,
Yeah.
eating enough protein, making sure that you're eating the right amount of energy when it comes to nutrition, making sure that and if you're eating enough produce, you're going to be getting plenty of micronutrients, but like making sure that you're getting, micronutrients and phytonutrients from food. But if you're eating enough produce, you already got that covered, and fiber covered for the most part, if you're doing that.
Mhm.
So it's really like there's a couple of simple things that you really like most people need to be doing to get their most out of their nutrition. And then if you want to further, get into the weeds about things beyond that, but most people don't have those basics put into place, and we're looking for, or we're worried about, this the reduction here. So now I have to take a greens powder or whatever, and the reality is like get the habits in place first, and these other things just you'll notice that they're really not that useful. Even if you can test them out if you want, but like I you mentioned a second ago, like I also took every supplement on the market for the most part, like for a period of time.
Yeah.
There was a year or 2 years, or it was 2 years where I just like I started reading every paper I could on supplements and health outcomes, and they were interesting. So I wanted to try all these supplements, and I can't tell you how many different things I've taken in, and like thinking they had a benefit, and then when I take them out and then put them back in, I'm like, oh wow, that actually was probably a placebo effect because I don't feel anything now. Like, but it's just we get caught up in thinking that it has to be complicated and it has to be this really, just meticulous thing that we do. We drink a certain amount of water as soon as we wake up, and then we do this next, and we do this next, and we do this next, and we have complicated lives. And we shouldn't be, for most of us, unless you work in this field, you shouldn't be investing this much mental energy into your nutrition and your nutrition habits. It should be something that is, you have to pay attention to it and invest some energy into it if you want to have a good, healthy nutrition. You got to plan ahead and all that type of stuff, but it shouldn't be something that consumes you and that you're always trying to like strive for that next thing and strive for that next thing and strive for that next thing. Cause it's just, if you're not working in this field, that mental energy would likely be better invested elsewhere in terms of your health, your career, your family, whatever the case may be. And I've seen so many people that just like they're putting so much mental energy into every little detail, and they think that they have to, to revolve their life around every single thing that they eat. And the reality is they could back off, 50%, get 90% of those results, and spend that other 50% of energy into things that would provide more value to their health and life.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. I love it. I'm glad my audience is going to hear this from, again, somebody else besides myself. A couple more, if you have the time. One of them, though, that I'd love to dive into for sure is around kind of the cancer risk in meat. And specifically, I think it's kind of geared towards the nitrates in some of the processed meat. And so maybe you could shed some light on, why is there this risk? Who's named the risk? And give us kind of some sense of what's the relative versus absolute risk, and do we need to be concerned about it?
Yeah. So with this, this is based on the associations of the processed meat with colorectal cancer, and the absolute or the relative risk is 18% increased risk of colorectal cancer with, I think it's like 50 grams serving of processed meats per day. So it's like if you're eating couple ounces of processed meat every single day, those individuals very consistently, the data is pretty clear here, that they have higher rates of colorectal cancer. Now, you mentioned absolute versus relative risk of 20% increase or 18% increase in relative risk equals about a 1% increase in absolute risk. So absolute risk means that if you it's taking in the relative risk versus your lifetime risk of colorectal cancer. So for the average person, your lifetime risk of getting colorectal cancer is about 4%. And so that goes up to 5% if you're eating processed meats every day, you're going to have an 18% risk. This discussion is a little bit more complicated, though, because processed meats include things like potted meat, sausage, bacon, and then they also include like turkey from, sliced at the deli. And so I think that we can't really classify all of these things together. They've consistently been classified in the research because it's just the way that things have been classified. Lunch meats, deli meats, all of that stuff gets classified together. But in my opinion, there's probably a significant difference in terms of how that's going to impact your cancer risk if you're having a sliced turkey breast versus, sausage and something that's high in saturated fat, high in salt. There's multiple mechanisms that would make sense. Now, the nitrates, there is some evidence that these can be converted into nitrosamines, and this might be the mechanism through which they can increase cancer risk. However, there's also, we also have to pay attention to the fact that there's nitrates in vegetables, and we're eating more nitrates through vegetables than we would actually get exposed to through the nitrates that are added to processed meats. So the thought process there is that the vegetables actually have certain constituents that help to reduce the conversion of those nitrates to nitrosamine so that they're less harmful. And so, the hypothesis is that if we eat some of these nitrates with more vegetables in the diet, that can help mitigate some of that risk as well. But in my opinion, if you're eating turkey breast, for example, especially if it's like, freshly sliced turkey breast or something, and and you're eating that on a sandwich with some tomato and some lettuce and a side of fruit, I don't have any concern with that. Now, the data isn't there to answer that question. This is one of those areas where there's gray, because all of these things have consistently been lumped together in any study.
Yeah, no, I love when we actually convert that 20% increased risk to the absolute risk, because I think it's easy to forget that there's risk regardless. Yeah. That you hear, there's an increased risk with colorectal cancer. So your assumption is if I don't eat any red meat, then I will have no risk. And it's like, no. There's always risk. Yeah. There's always still some baseline risk. And so that 4 to 5% increase is super helpful. Okay. The last in the weeds, if you're ready for it. And this is the battle over, the more grass-fed, pasture-based, wild-caught, all of the more natural types of raising animal products. Is there value there from a nutrition perspective to invest the money for those items?
Yeah, so this comes down to a lot of the same discussions that we've been having. In the differences are probably about the same as what we see with like conventional versus organic. Like with grass-fed beef, and I just reviewed some of that data from my podcast episode because I discussed that with grass-fed beef. There's a slightly different saturated fatty acid composition. So there's a little bit less saturated fats. There's just a better profile, but it's marginally different. It's not like there's no saturated fat and it's monounsaturated fat and they're loaded with omega-3s. It's just not the case. Now, grass-fed beef has significantly more omega-3 than non-grass-fed beef. The caveat to this is neither are a good source of omega-3s. So
Yeah.
I hear this used as a marketing for the grass-fed versions of beef that people say, oh, it's 3 times more omega-3 or 5 times more omega-3, because there is studies that show like 3 to 5 times more omega-3 fatty acids, like EPA, for example. But we're looking at like, it would take like 100 servings to equal what you would get from a serving of salmon. Like it's a very small amount. It's like 10 milligrams per serving. It's a almost insignificant amount of omega-3 fatty acids. So if you go from an insignificant amount to a also insignificant amount that's a little bit higher, like there's no value there. And some of this is just being promoted in a way that's a little bit misleading and it goes back to what you mentioned with the absolute and relative change. The relative change is 3 times more. The absolute change is 4 milligrams per serving, which is almost nothing. And so this is same thing with eggs. Eggs is even worse. The omega-3 fatty acid composition of eggs is like almost 0. And then the like cage, the pasture raised eggs is way higher than it's like 0.0003 milligrams per serving. Like it's a tiny amount. And then the omega-3 composition of the pastured is much higher, but still extremely low. I mean, it's completely insignificant. And so these differences they're there, but they're not substantial. Like, for example, beta carotene in pastured eggs is going to be higher. That's what gives them the yolks, the orange color. But if you had a quarter of a serving of sweet potatoes with your non-pastured eggs, it would equal the same amount of beta carotene that you would get from the pastured eggs. So I recommend with this one, because this discussion goes beyond nutrition. And this is where you have to just I don't think like these choices shouldn't be made about nutrition. Like if you're gonna buy pastured eggs, then I would say if you're buying them for the fact that okay, these chickens have a better life, they are they get to roam in the pastures, they get a more quote unquote natural life. If that's where your decision making is coming from, then I think those things are worth it. But if it's coming from a strict nutrition standpoint, you're not like there. It's just not going to be worth the increased cost.
Yeah, I mean, that point about, you can make up the difference in beta carotene with a cup of carrots. I think that's where we get really lost. We hear these percentages and they can be so convincing from a marketing perspective, but in the grand scheme of your diet, it might really not move the needle much. Well, this has been really helpful. I think we focused a lot on what not to do. You did kind of mention a little bit about kind of just some basic healthy habits, but maybe we kind of close out with just a brief like, hey, well, what the heck should we be focusing on? If these aren't their choices that we need to be making, what choices do we need to be making? I mean,
the first thing is eating the right amount of energy for your needs, like not eating too little and too much. Now, that doesn't mean you have to track all the time, but for many people, it's just getting an understanding of what your needs are and kind of eating according to those and getting into a pattern. Because if you're overeating, there's negative health effects with overeating. And this is, the most inflammatory thing you can do is consistently overeat. Like that's worse than any like inflammatory food. You consistently overeat, that's going to lead to an increase in what are called adipokines, which are inflammatory cytokines that are released from excess adipose tissue, which is your fat cells. And so that's most important. And then undereating is also not a good thing, which is what a lot of people are doing. Is the general pattern that I see among health conscious individuals is like chronically undereating and then binging, and then chronically undereating and then binging. So undereating is also not ideal. Fueling yourself appropriately, making sure that you have the energy you need to do the thing, to carry out the tasks and recover from whatever type of training that you're doing is really important. Eating enough fiber, eating enough protein, those are also incredibly important targets. Consuming protein depends on a lot of things, but for most people, at least like 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight tends to be like a lower end. If you're training more, you probably want to be on a little bit higher than that, but eating enough protein, eating enough fiber, which general recommendations are about 28 grams of fiber per in your diet per 2,000 calories, so 14 per 1,000 calories. But fiber, eat as much as you can get in my opinion, that it's not causing like digestive issues. There's going to be benefit beyond that. So highly recommend, focusing on those as major targets. And if you're building your diet around, you're eating, I always recommend getting into a schedule as well. And I think this is underrated. A lot of people try to hit calorie and protein targets like by eating sporadically. And if you just get into a good routine around like 3 meals, 1 snack, or whatever fits for you, 2 meals, 2 snacks, whatever like fits your lifestyle and your own, schedule. If you get into a good schedule around that, it gets a lot easier. It takes off some of that mental bandwidth. Your meals look the same. And so like, when you sit down for lunch, you're having about this size meal at this time, and it becomes a lot easier. It takes away some of that decision making. So if you're eating 3 balanced meals throughout the day, they have plenty of protein, plenty of produce and fiber, and that meets your energy needs. That's where most of the like benefit from nutrition, like that's most of nutrition summed up in those little targets. And outside of that, there's a lot of foods that you can add in that are more nutritious and things like that. But if you're focusing on those things, you'll have a lot of it in place already, and you don't have to focus on every little thing. And then after that, after you get these habits in place, then you can go a little bit further into the weeds on specific foods and trying to really optimize things.
Yeah, you can pretty much stop following a lot of social media accounts with that advice. I just want to let everyone know that you can find more from Adrian on his podcast, the Nutrition Science Podcast. We're going to put a link to that. Patrick will do that in the show notes. And then also on Instagram, you're putting out so much good content, and I really appreciate it. We'll have the link to that. It's Dr. Adrian Chavez, right?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of the great information. I'm sure my audience is going to love this one.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Just one more reminder before we let you go. If you are not yet subscribed or following the show wherever you are listening or watching this particular episode, please do consider doing so that you do not miss another episode, and so that EC and I can sleep a little better at night. Thank you in advance. Thank you also for your ratings and your reviews. EC and I see them all, and we appreciate them, unless they're mean, in which case we do not appreciate them. But there are very few of those. So thank you in advance if you haven't yet left us a rating or a review. EC and I will be back next week for another episode of The Consistency Project.